Welcome everyone to the Regent Center for Humanity Common Good interview series. My name is Jens Zimmermann. I'm Professor of Theology here at Regent College and Director Center. And today it's my distinct pleasure to welcome two guests, Kheriaty, who is a clinical psychiatrist and medical ethicist from California, and Professor Douglas Farrow, who is a professor of theology and ethics at McGill University. And we're here to talk about the theme of Kheriaty's latest book, the New Abnormal, The Rise of the Biomedical Security State, and how all people but Christians should be concerned about his argument there and what our reaction or response should be. So welcome both of you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks,
I thought we start out, people can Google who you are and your credentials online, but what people can never Google is your sort of formation, intellectual background, the context in which you were formed, which leads you to the positions that you hold. So I thought we could begin by just you both telling us a little bit about sort of what texts and events formed you, intellectually, theologically, philosophically, if you will, to be who you are now. So maybe we could start with you, Aaron.
So I discovered philosophy at the University of Notre Dame as an undergraduate, and we had to take two courses in philosophy, a required course and an elective, to graduate, and I found the Intro to Philosophy course very fascinating. So at the time I was studying, I think, biochemistry. It was a pre-med major, and I discovered that I could actually get a degree in philosophy and the humanities and also the pre-med requirements. So I got a dual degree at Notre Dame and was considering either going to graduate school in philosophy, and my focus as an undergraduate was really history of philosophy, history of ethics, quite a bit of exposure to ancient and medieval philosophy, but also a pretty good overview of modern philosophy. And I was considering medicine and philosophy, and my then girlfriend, now wife, suggested, well, if you do philosophy, you'll only do philosophy professionally, whereas if you do medicine, you can get involved in medical ethics, and there may be ways to combine both of those interests. So I decided I'll apply to med school. If I get in, I will go, which is what happened, and was able to continue pursuing medical ethics. I studied at Georgetown as a medical student, did some work with Edmund Pellegrino, who's one of sort of the grand old men of American bioethics, chaired the President's Council on Bioethics for a number of years. And I was able to do some bioethics work with him and continue my research in bioethics in residency. So in my career, I've been able to combine both of those things and spent about half my time doing bioethics related work and the other half of my time doing clinical work and teaching and more directly medically oriented work. I've always had a strong interest as well in Christian theology. I was born and raised Catholic and would spend my free time in medical school reading Dante, and for any of those familiar with the Catholic theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar, I read all 8 volumes of his Theological Aesthetics in medical schools to unwind after class. So I was a little bit of an anomaly, I think, among physicians in having a keen interest in both philosophy and in Christian theology. And so there are probably too many formative influences, both in terms of individuals that I've had the privilege of knowing, wonderful teachers at the undergraduate level. David Solomon, who taught me history of ethics at Notre Dame, founded the Institute for Ethics and Culture there. And Pellegrino, who I mentioned at Georgetown, and then others that I've just have the privilege of knowing within medicine and within other disciplines as well.
That's great.
That's a short version of
thank
intellectual.
Before we go to Doug, can I just ask, so what kind of, Hans Urs von Balthasar has this massive theological aesthetics. What kind of themes attracted you? Did you just sort of read them Like you read a phone book, like from A to Z? Or?
I did. I dabbled around in some of his shorter works first, and I had a friend when I was an undergraduate who was a graduate student in theology who was very keen on von Balthasar, so he sort of turned me onto it. And among theologians, he's a very fine writer, which is sometimes rare. And I was just intrigued by his proposal to sort of reverse the traditional order of the transcendentals, at least the Kantian order of the transcendentals, and begin with the beautiful, which is how his great sort of triptych works. It's the moving from the theological aesthetics, the theme of beauty, and the beauty of the form of the incarnate Christ, to the good, or his second part is the theodrama, and he uses this metaphor of from the theater, actually, to describe the drama of the encounter between human freedom and divine freedom. And then he ends with an account of the true. And so I haven't gotten through part 2 or part 3 of that yet. The first 8 volumes kind of exhausted me. And then I moved on to, reading more Augustine and other people in the tradition. So I haven't gone back to Balthasar very much since then, but he was an entry point for me to move from, I guess, a modern theologian, and gradually I've worked my way back more and more to an interest in reading the patristic sources.
Okay, great. Douglas?
Well, I began by pursuing biblical studies, and then partly through the influence of some people who were coming here to Regent to do summer courses with students here, I began studying theology more seriously. And when I went on to do my doctoral work at King's College London with Colin Gunton, I made a decision to pursue systematic and historical theology as my main discipline. And in those days, Karl Barth was someone that the people I was with liked to study, and Barth and Balthasar, of course, knew each other.
Yeah.
And Barth joked at one point that he was delighted to see von Balthasar packing around Volume 2, Part 1 of the Church Dogmatics like a cat with its kitten. Yeah. But anyways, as I pursued theology, and then after teaching at King's, went on to teach at McGill, being in a more militantly secularist kind of institution. McGill is a bit more like University College London than King's College London. And so I had to become had to develop a wide spectrum of disciplines. I expanded into ethics and into political theology. And that expansion into political theology grew quite naturally out of the doctoral work that I had done on the doctrine and the history of the doctrine of the ascension of Jesus. Because of course you can't think about the ascension of Jesus except in the modes given you, which are fulfillment, especially of the offices of the king and the high priest. And the kingly demands that you think about the way authority works in the world and the nature of the political dimensions of the human being. So that's, but the biblical stuff never left me. So people who read me, even if they're reading my Substack, they know to expect these biblical texts to be somehow paradigmatic for the theological and political thinking that I'm doing.
Yeah, very good. And you already touched on some themes that we want to talk about: authority, freedom, and biblical anthropology, what it means to be made in God's image, and how that comes to bear or not in our current situation. So let me frame our discussion a bit, that all these kind of questions will circle around. So Aaron, you've written this book, The Rise of the Biomedical Security State, and you're using as a jumping off point, not as the main focus of the book, is what we're emerging from now, the COVID pandemic. For 3 years, we've been in the grip of this thing, right, and we're now sort of coming out of it. And you have made observations in the book, something to the effect that this crystallizes, public policies, attitudes, structures that have been in play for a long time, that have come to the fore during the pandemic, and structures that are, leading to this biomedical surveillance security mentality in healthcare, which are detrimental to or opposed to, I would say, the picture of what it means to be human, that Christians should hold.
Right.
So that's our sort of context. And as we're coming out of it, like one of the things that is really remarkable right now is that the narrative, so I mean, there's sort of two versions. The official narrative is still we're coming out of a pandemic, but the data and even reports in big newspapers like Newsweek and the New York Times, and here, even some articles here in Canada on the National Post, they're now showing that there's a lot of holes in this sort of pandemic narrative, right? I mean, that we overplayed really what is a virus that's not a deadly killer virus, but a virus that is probably as deadly as a flu. We've overreacted with measures like lockdowns and all these kind of things. And we've all acquiesced in this, and when you tried to criticize it, you were shut down. Churches all went along with this. We're now seeing, like in the mainline newspapers, that the story wasn't quite so. So that's very liberating. But I think we also need to look at why did we go along with it? Why wasn't there a greater sense of resistance, perhaps? And what lessons can we learn from this? I mean, you're doing some of this in your book, and how does this work toward or predispose us toward this biomedical security state that was de facto put in place to deal with the pandemic. So that's sort of the context. So let me just ask you both this question, both of you to respond to it in whatever way you want. As Christians who believe that human beings are made in God's image and likeness, and thus we possess inherent dignity, freedom, moral accountability, and I would add sociality, we need to be together. In what ways did the public reaction to COVID reveal to you trends, and perhaps, as I said already, existing trends that were exacerbated or came fully to the fore, that reveal our disregard of this biblical anthropology, of a Christian biblical view of human identity? And maybe Aaron, you to start, and maybe Doug, in your response, you could take particular reference to the church, how the church dealt with this. So I don't know if this is fair, but I'll set you up a little bit like the psychiatrist and the theologian, although you're both speaking both as Christians.
So I think COVID revealed that many Christians implicitly embrace, if not explicitly, the notion that we exist mostly on the plane of the material, that physical health is the highest human good to be preserved at whatever cost to any other human, psychological, social, spiritual goods, that nothing was sufficiently sacred that it couldn't be sacrificed on the altar of bare biological life, to use Giorgio Agamben's phrase, that human populations as a whole were sort of an inert biomass to be orchestrated and manipulated by a group of technocratic, Gnostic elites that supposedly knew what everyone ought to do for the sake of their own good, and were willing to not just encourage them, but force certain interventions on them in the name of their own health, their own well-being. And that met very little resistance within and outside the church, which I think was disconcerting. And so I think now is a time when we're coming out of this phase of maybe sleepwalking through this thing, and being subjected to fear in such a way that we became too passive in the face of encountering this novel challenge, that now is the time for Christians to think about the goods that they sacrificed and whether those were truly accidental and could be disposed of in a crisis, or whether those are central to who we are as human beings. Face-to-face encounters, public worship, the sacramental life of the church, being with loved ones at the most important moments of life, whether it's a wedding or a funeral, being able to bury the dead, which is something that hasn't been prohibited since the time of Antigone up until COVID, where there were public health agencies requiring bodies to be cremated and prohibiting a traditional Christian burial for individuals who had died of COVID on a purely theoretical risk that actually was not any sort of real risk, the idea that a corpse might be contagious or might be able to spread this illness. So I think we need to reflect now on truly what is essential and what is perhaps less essential, or what can be adjusted or compromised under extreme circumstances. Because I fear that we relinquished, without any resistance, without any objection, without any fight, things that were in fact essential, and that compromised the lives of citizens in terms of civil liberties and freedoms, and their own health and well-being, ironically. All this done in the name of health was enormously damaging to the health of the population as a whole. And all-cause mortality did not go up during COVID, but it went up during the mass vaccination campaign in the wake of what was supposed to be the worst part of the pandemic. So we sacrificed all this for the sake of physical health, and what we got was a relinquishing of all those goods, plus worse physical health and worse morbidity and mortality outcomes than we would have had we done nothing or just gone about life as usual.
And as a psychiatrist, like, do you see ongoing damage?
Oh, without a doubt.
Yeah.
Without a doubt. And the numbers are clear. People are suffering extremely high rates of anxiety, depression, drug and alcohol abuse, so-called deaths of despair, death by suicide, alcohol and drug-related illnesses spiked almost immediately during the pandemic, and we're continuing to see high and rising rates of suicide, particularly among young people. So there's absolutely no doubt, from the point of view of mental health and human flourishing, that we're living in very, very difficult times. I think, while this word is now thrown around rather indiscriminately, everything is traumatizing these days, it seems. But I think we are actually suffering a form of collective trauma from lockdowns, school closures, and other coercive one-size-fits-all policies that were forced upon entire populations.
Doug, what do you think?
Well, one of the impressions that has been left by the churches during this whole period, right from the beginning, is that they are at best chaplains to the culture. And so when the note of retreat is urgently sounded, retreat from human sociality and other dimensions of seeking the human good than merely preserving bodily life, there, in a certain sense, they simply followed the culture, but in another sense, rather than even waiting to be chaplain to the culture, they dashed ahead. They were the first to give up their meeting together. And I found that very striking about the early days of the pandemic and the lockdowns, that the church was no source of resistance. There were churches, individual churches, and occasionally dioceses that were resistant, but the vast majority of them put up no resistance and seemed actually quite eager to retreat, which made me wonder how deep was their commitment to core Christian doctrines, the notion that is at the heart of their doctrine that God Himself takes humanity and the Son is made incarnate and becomes the center of a community that is being reformed in the image of God. The whole communal dimension of this, the incarnational dimension of this, the being in person, the being face to face, the communication in the body and blood of Christ, all of these things just suddenly seemed unimportant to people who had said that they were centrally important. So I think the pandemic exposed a tremendous weakness in the church and an inconsistency with what it says it believes and what it actually did, because clearly the church has too put the preservation of bodily life ahead of all of the other goods, and these are generally higher goods than the body and the preservation of bodily life. And so they didn't even notice that the people who were dying from COVID were the same people who were dying from ordinary flus every year. That is, the people who were very aged and frail, or who had multiple morbidities that made them especially susceptible. And they bought the whole line that this was a danger equally to everyone, therefore everyone must cower from it until everyone can get therapeutic treatments that were supposed to prevent this mortality from overtaking you. And of course, as we now know, none of that was true.
So let me, there's two things I want to talk to you about. There's fear of death and virtual reality, because they relate to what you've just said. And so I was surprised on the one hand that, our whole society, I think, has a problem with, what the ancient used to call the art of dying. That if you know how to die well, you will live well. So where has that disappeared to, especially in the church that used to be known for not fearing death? We both, all three of us read patristic sources, and I always remember in our theology class, Athanasius is on the incarnation when he's gone through all the proofs and arguments. He said, but if you want to look how this really all bears out and comes down, the real proof is look at us Christians. We're not afraid of death.
Yeah.
Right. So where has that attitude gone? Like, what has happened there? And the other point is the virtual reality thing. Like, how this was obviously prior to COVID. We've been prepared to think that it is no big deal to have the Lord's table virtually. So maybe you could just both comment on those two aspects, which I found stunning.
Yes, well, I think they're linked, actually. Perhaps part of the difficulty lies in an inadequate sacramental theology and a kind of nominalist view of the sacrament, the central sacrament of the church. So that it is a matter of remembering rather than of actually eating and drinking, as Paul says. And so, well, you can remember at home just as well as at church. And so there was I called it a retreat to this virtual reality, which is a bit like the Hotel California. You can enter this, but you can't leave it. You cede to the authorities the right to take you out of actual fellowship together into virtual reality. And well, what's the next step? Well, we just cut you off from the virtual reality. We can flip that switch quite easily. And that people were willing to do that shows not only the lack of robustness of their contemplating Christian. When Athanasius wrote that work, how old was he? 22, 23, something like that? People were, I'm not saying he was a typical Christian, obviously he was an outstanding and unusual Christian, but he understood Christian doctrine in such a way as to give him courage. He was exiled from his see 5 times in his life because he crossed the imperial authorities and insisted on the church being the church and the state not having the right to tell the church what to do in things that belong to the church's own mandate. And so there was a struggle within the church, and there was a struggle between the church and the state, and 5 times he had to leave his see in Alexandria. But he had the courage to stick by his convictions. And this business that he talked about not being afraid of death, we were panic-stricken, as if those years of hiding our mortality away suddenly bore this fruit. We were exposed to the fact that we were all mortal by these, daily ticker tape accounts of the death toll. And so even this business about burial versus cremation, the general move to cremation in countries as spacious as our countries in North America cannot be explained in terms of lack of space to bury the dead. It's a movement away from that Christian respect for the body that looks forward to the resurrection and understands that the person is body and soul together. And I think we've been hiding our mortality away for quite a long time. And suddenly in COVID, mortality was thrust on us as a publicly visible, 24/7 visible business, and people were spooked. But then they're not, even when Christians are spooked by that, they're absolutely the opposite of what Athanasius was talking about. They're people who do have a fear of death. The author of Hebrews tells us that the Christ came to deliver us from the fear of death, and the fear of death had led us into bondage as we ran to escape it. And that's what's happening now. Our rush to escape death is leading us into bondage to political and economic forces utilizing this Trojan horse of public health to enslave the society.
And the ideology of bare life.
That fear of death was used politically and deliberately with sophisticated military-grade propaganda, deliberately trying to increase levels of fear of the virus in order to facilitate more compliance with government mandates. So our ruling class and our governing authorities recognized that the power of the fear of death and the grip that it had on people's minds, and they exploited that for their own ends and purposes, whether economic or political. And I just didn't hear very many Christian pastors, priests standing up at the pulpit, echoing St. Paul's almost gleeful proclamation in the face of death, "O death, where is thy sting?" And that suggests to me a lack of faith, a lack of adequate formation of Christians into what it means to be a Christian, and that there are certain goods, certain truths, certain practices that are worth dying for, as Christians have done over the ages. That Christians have always, during epidemics, ministered to the sick, even many heroic priests and ministers caring for the sick and the dying at some degree of risk to their own health. And we had a situation in which those risks to anyone over the age of 70 were really negligible. And yet we didn't see a push from the churches to insist that, no, this is central to our ministry, our mandate from Christ, that we care for the sick and the dying in this way. And so that suggests to me exactly what Doug mentioned, that our lived faith and our grounding in these convictions was perhaps more tenuous than many of us would like to have seen. COVID was a revelation. It was an apocalypse in the original meaning of the term. It was an unveiling of what was already there operating beneath the surface. And what was unveiled was not always very edifying to see.
So I'd like to go to another point that was triggered by your saying there was these deliberate attempts by governments. I know this was true in Germany, it was true in England, it was true here in Canada, of using what you call military grade mental propaganda to inflict fear. I mean, in Germany and in Britain, they were actually, and I don't know why it never caused a bigger ruckus, panic papers that were given, that were solicited, commissioned from, where some of your colleagues would work, like psychiatrists. They say, okay, this is what you do, because people do not panic soon enough to follow our directives. So here's what we will put into these papers that you will disseminate through the media, which were things like, the children will kill granny, because children are notorious for not getting it. So this is one way of how they get it, and so on and so forth. That was done deliberately. Which brings us to the nanny state, right? That thinks the people are not responsible. They can't be trusted with thinking or reacting responsibly. We need to shepherd them. We need to indoctrinate them. Now that's one aspect. So can we just shelve that for 1 second? I'll get back there. Before we go off this topic we just had, is Doug, as a theologian, what would you say now that we have this lull, this moment of reflection on what's happened? What should the church strengthen in its teaching, preaching, theology, or practice to bring this back, a stronger sense of mortality, not fearing death, and so on?
Well, I think the churches need to recover a better sense of what human goods are seen as goods in the light of the gospel of Christ, and how those goods should be ordered or prioritized. And they also need to rediscover the independence of the church from the state, recognize that the church has a mandate from God to be and do certain things, and they don't get that from the state, and they do not need the state's permission and must not behave as if they needed the state's permission to fulfill this mandate. Because if they need the state's permission, they are conceding to the state a greater authority than the authority of the risen and ascended Christ. So perhaps the fear of death on the personal level, and also the kind of herd instinct, the panic that it besets the whole, indicates that they are not as well practiced in the resurrection faith as they should be, but also their willingness to cede the authority of the church to the state suggests to me that they're not as well inculcated and practiced in the confession of the ascended Lord, who is not simply Lord of the minds or emotions of people who choose to confess him, but is Lord of all. So there's a serious eschatological deficiency related to the doctrine of the resurrection and the doctrine of the ascension that accompanies this anthropological deficiency as to what a human being is and how human goods ought to be ordered.
Yeah, and I guess along those lines, I mean, there's an extension of this. You might summarize it as fearing God rather than man. Finding the right balance there in terms of respecting the government but not being under the government. an extension of that into a host of other issues that the church is facing right now, where Christians, I think, are too afraid to look like fools who march to a different drum. Right? I mean, would you say? Or?
Well, yes. I mean, if the church's most primitive confession is Jesus Kyrios rather than Kaiser Kyrios, Jesus is Lord, not Caesar is Lord, then its very nature is not to reject the concerns of secular authorities, but never to submit the higher concerns of the Great Commission to the governance of secular authorities on any fundamental level. Now, the accidents of that mission, this is areas zoned for certain types of buildings, so you can't build another type of building in this area. Those sorts of things always have to be negotiated with secular authorities, and there are some things that fall in the realm of health that also need to be negotiated, and fire escapes and whatever. But when you start submitting the fundamental mandate of the church to the dictates of public health officials, you've got a serious problem. And when the state is rebranding everything as public health, everything, then of course they've got you completely over a barrel, don't they?
Yeah, they do. So, beautiful segue back to where we were a minute ago with the biosecurity state. I mean, this is one of the features, is it not, that you mentioned in your book, that everything gets now branded as a health
That's right.
Issue. So could you, I know this is very hard to ask of you, but could you, like in a few sentences, say what do you mean by the biosecurity, the medical biosecurity state, and then we can talk more around that.
Yeah, so the biomedical security state is the melding together of three things that formerly were more or less distinct. First, an increasingly militarized public health apparatus, which I describe in more detail in the book. Second, the use of digital technologies, mobile phones, for example, for greater surveillance and control over populations in the name of health security. And these two apparatuses, the increasingly militarized public health apparatus combined with digital technologies of surveillance and control, are reinforced and backed up by the police powers of the state. So those are the three elements. And what undergirds the functioning of the biomedical security state is a declared state of exception or state of emergency, either at the national or federal level or at the state level or at both, where normal constitutional protections and civil liberties are suspended or bracketed in the name of a health emergency. So with the lockdowns, for example, of March 2020, what we saw being put in place was not just a novel, previously untested, and it turns out damaging and ineffective method to try to control the spread of a respiratory virus. What we saw with lockdowns and school closures was a new paradigm of governance that was rolled out, this biomedical security paradigm of governance. And with this paradigm of governance, for it to continue functioning and for executives to maintain the powers, the additional powers that they gain during a state of emergency, basically it requires that society function by jumping from one declared crisis to the next. And so we see an effort now to recreate the next scare, the next public health crisis. We see efforts to redefine what used to be understood as environmental or social or moral issues, anything from climate change to racism, and bracket for a moment your views on those issues. Those issues have been redefined over the last several years as public health issues in many instances, in need of the administrations of public health experts to tell us what to do about them. And once something is redefined as a public health issue, it can then be declared a public health crisis if we think the issue is serious enough. And that biosecurity apparatus that I just described can then be redeployed to deal with, the energy crisis or the climate crisis or a financial crisis or the attack of a computer virus that's maybe a threat to our critical infrastructure. And once you're in a system whose fuel is the state of emergency, you no longer have a constitution. You no longer have separation of powers. You have a piece of paper that is temporarily, but then more or less permanently bracketed. And so that, I believe, is a threat to Western liberal democracies. And COVID already showed that the state of emergency can continue for the better part of 3 years, regardless of what the actual evidence in data and case count and hospital situation shows. Very few people are pushing back against the fact that we're still operating under a federal state of emergency in the United States of America, under a state of emergency in my home state of California, and those 128 additional extra constitutional powers that the President of the United States accrues, including access to funding to deal with the emergency, have still not been relinquished and are probably not going to be voluntarily relinquished until there's adequate political pressure to end the state of emergency.
And I know that there are a number of policy changes suggested in order to, in the name of security and in the name of this security state, and one of which, for instance, is, I don't know how many people know this, but the World Health Organization is currently negotiating with the United States, with Europe and Canada, about a whole new set of, really a revision of their powers in order to call out and to implement, call out an emergency, implement emergency measures against the sovereignty, like overruling the sovereignty of individual countries. And that after we've seen a miserable pandemic management. But that is what's being proposed. And I don't think people generally are aware of the wide-ranging influences that it will have on how we deal with these kind of things, right? So that's, but this surveillance state, for the sake of security, can you tell us a bit more about what view of human nature do you think underlies? How can one even think of that's how I want a society run, versus how we think we're running society based on some model of human nature that presumes that we have a constitution, that we have constitutional rights and freedoms, that politicians that want to do something have to respect that and have to sort of arrive at some kind of consensus that's so democratically arrived at, right? There's a different view of the human being between these two. Can you just...
I think it's fundamentally, if you drill down deeply enough, it's a view that there is no such thing as human nature. There is no given in human beings that needs to be regarded, whether it's particular forms of embodiment, whether it's our rationality and our ability to, participate in a shared rationality, our participation in the logos that allows discussion and debate, and work toward coming to a truth that we can embrace. And it's a view of human nature that requires people who think they know best for everyone to be given unprecedented powers, including powers of propaganda and coercion, to shape this inert population, this biomass, in the direction that they believe things need to go. So that would contrast with a Christian view of human nature, or even a philosophical, traditional, maybe Greek, Platonic philosophical view of human nature, that would see human beings as having certain givens, as being intrinsically sociable, and for the sake of our human flourishing, we can't simply interact from behind screens. It's going to harm us in various ways, including harm our health. That sees human beings as rational and free, that sees human beings as embodied, as an organic whole organism that's naturally oriented toward health and human flourishing. That medicine's role is adjunctive; it's removing obstacles to that natural flourishing. No, we have to bracket all of that. The human being is defined as per se non-working or subfunctional until we give it the right mRNA software update, or until we sort of, shape human beings in a particular way to make sure that they are healthy or safe or what have you. So I think it's a contrast between people who think there is such a thing as human nature that requires some level of regard and respect, and that allows for individual agency, versus a view that human beings are simply raw material that can be shaped by technocratic expertise for the sake of particular predetermined ends.
Let me ask you to expand on one more issue here before I'm going to give the last word to Doug to say something about what that, so what does the, to put it this way, what does the Bible tell us what it means to be made in God's image that speaks to these kind of changes between the nanny state or the biomedical security state and a more humane form of government. And Aaron, what I'm alluding to is you have this really interesting bit in your book on two kinds of rationality. Yeah. I found that fascinating because it seems such an abstract notion, and yet I think it goes to the heart of how we deal with people and how a government either decides, like, people are rational beings whom I need to persuade. We now sort of call it the Swedish approach to the pandemic. We appeal to people's common sense, understanding, and if there is something really wrong, they obviously have a sense of that, and they will want to comply with necessary measures, but we'll leave it up to people's responsibility, which is not the approach that we took. So you talk about two kinds of rationalities that are in competition. Can you just explain that a bit?
I think very broadly, if you were to distill a philosophical representative, a Platonic view of what I described as a shared participation in the logos, that all of us are rational and free by nature, capable of discovering the truth and adhering to it by the light of reason, that the world is ordered in an intelligible way that makes scientific inquiry possible in the first place, and with humble, open-ended approach to empirical reality, we can step by step, making many, many mistakes along the way, come to approximate truth, versus a radically relativistic understanding of reason as purely instrumental, as language is purely a tool for the accomplishment of particular material ends, to move history in a predetermined direction, to recreate human beings by recreating the social order. That ideas are just foam on the wave of history. There's the characteristic philosophical representative of this in its purest form could arguably be Karl Marx, but he's the end line of a long line of rationalist philosophers going back 500 years that were moving us in this particular direction of understanding rationality in these purely instrumental, highly relativistic terms. And these highly abstract metaphysical conceptions of reason and human beings' participation in reason have clear real-world implications for things like public policy, for governance, for political theory, for life together in a society. And I think we saw the instrumental view of reason prevail almost totally during the pandemic over the traditional Platonic view of human reason, which would be, I think, baptized by the early Christian thinkers like, Augustine, particularly, and later Aquinas. So the metaphysics and theology matter for the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And Doug, do you think it's fair to say that this is sort of a basic realist nominalist distinction?
I think this certainly plays into it and has for many centuries. We've gone down a particular path which is contrary to and contradictory of the Christian worldview. And it's when you start looking at that path and how we've tread it for many centuries, it's no real surprise, I think, that we have arrived at this point. And I think one thing that people miss about the present situation as they look at it is the way in which the pandemic is bound up with the desire to refound our social order and our economic order and our medical order on artificial intelligence. And one of the clues that this is something that we require some examination of is that before the pandemic, there were documents, I've looked at these documents, that were, especially in Europe, but also in North America, that mapped out the progress towards the use of a vaccine passport to establish biometrics as a norm for the monitoring of human beings and for the handling of the economy and so forth. So all this, it's not an accident that the digital IDs and the smart cities and all of this are being rolled out at the same time and even throughout the worst of the pandemic. Because to go back to what Aaron was saying, we've got to the point where our leaders, those who are thinking philosophically and also strategically as far as their own economic and political power goes, they think that artificial intelligence is the foundation on which the future will be built, and they don't see any fundamental difference between artificial intelligence and human intelligence, except that the one is more efficient than the other, the former than the latter. And so this I think ties in with what was just said, the notion that a human being is both a rational and a volitional creature, able to be volitional because it is rational, because it participates in a knowledge of the order of things as instilled by the Creator into the creation, and therefore able to consciously order itself to the good and to make choices that instantiate the good. Its rationality and its volitionality are fundamentally bound together. If you can't see the difference between that and artificial intelligence, where there's no actual agency involved, algorithms are not agents, then there's a very serious problem. So if you talk about building the future on artificial intelligence, you're talking about a future without meaningful agency. And of course, that's not possible. What is possible is that a few people who control the algorithms exercise their agency, whereas the rest of us do not. Yeah. And so they cultivate in us this sense of the inevitability of being overrun by artificial intelligence. And they use the crisis like the one we've been through, in which they turned into a crisis for the purpose of extending these powers so as to institute the advances that they had already mapped out. And again, I'm not talking through the top of my head here. I've looked at some of this. Yeah. And to make sure that we go down the line they mean us to go down. And to bring it full circle, the gospel of Jesus Christ promises us deliverance through death, from death. Because the gospel is not merely a story about the crucifixion of Jesus, it's also a story about the resurrection of Jesus. These people don't and can't offer us that, except in some thin Gnostic fashion where your ideas may be collected in databanks which may survive you by a very long time. Since they can't offer you a real rescue from death, what do? They cultivate in you a fear of death so that you become manipulable to their agendas. And it's only that gospel that pronounces the deliverance through death, from death, of the whole person, that gives the requisite courage and strength to say what Athanasius said: we Christians are not afraid of death, and therefore we are not subject to lifelong bondage.
I think that's a great note to end our conversation on. I want to thank you both for coming. Aaron, thank you for writing this book. I hope it's read much, and people, I don't think you might get this now and then. I don't think it's particularly alarmist to point out the things that have already been on the march for a long time. I mean, you're not the first person that warns us. We've had warnings since the 1950s about these kind of developments, and I think they've just really come fully home to roost in many ways during the last years. So thank you for sounding that warning bell, and thank you both for coming, and hope to see you again.
Good.
Likewise.
Thank you.